Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us for Newsmakers. I'm KC Counts. The subject material of our program may be difficult or inappropriate for some of our viewers, as we'll be discussing gun violence and suicide in New Mexico. State lawmakers have been considering several pieces of legislation to curb the worsening problem. Today we'll be joined by Miranda Viscoli, the co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence, about legislation the organization supports and what it sees as the sensible path forward. First, New Mexico had the 12th highest rate of gun violence in the nation as of July of 2022, according to everystat.org. It cites guns as the leading cause of death among children and teens. Gun deaths increased 53% from 2010 to 2020, compared to 33% nationwide. The state has the 5th highest societal cost of over $3,100 per resident per year. 63% of gun deaths in New Mexico are suicides, and 30% are homicides. Before we welcome today's guest, KRWG multimedia journalist Jonny Coker talked with her, State Attorney General Raul Torres, and Doña Ana County Sheriff Kim Stewart about the proposed legislation.
This year, during the New Mexico legislative session, multiple bills have been put forth regarding firearm-related legislation. This comes as New Mexico's firearm-related deaths are on the rise, with a jump of 55% from 2010 to 2020, according to the New Mexico Department of Health. Miranda Viscoli is the co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence, a nonprofit organization that advocates for a reduction in firearm injury and death. She said that she's in favor of House Bill 9, which would require gun owners to keep guns stored in a manner that would keep them away from children, and House Bill 100, which would enact a 14-day waiting period for the purchase of new firearms. Both bills are sponsored exclusively by Democratic representatives.
You know, gun ownership isn't going away. It probably shouldn't go away, right? But how do we live with the idea of gun ownership and people being able to own guns, but at the same time come to the table and go, hey guys, here are some common sense solutions that will save lives.
According to the fiscal impact reports prepared by the Legislative Finance Committee, the yearly cost to New Mexico for convictions would be at least $9,600 per inmate for county jails, and at least $26,600 per inmate for the New Mexico Corrections Department. New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres visited Las Cruces recently to speak with local leaders and residents about issues facing southern New Mexico. Although he said he is in favor of House Bill 9, he says his focus is on how the Attorney General's office can help prosecute gun crimes in a practical and efficient way.
Well, there are a lot of things that we can do in terms of new law enforcement strategies. One of the things that we put into our budget was a request for funding for a Crime Gun Intelligence Center. And that actually would result in funding to purchase new equipment for the Las Cruces area so that we could actually collect casings from crime scenes and then analyze whether or not that had been connected with a gun that was used in other crimes across county boundaries or in other jurisdictions. And what that will do is enable us to see in real time which crime guns are being used in which communities, and importantly, where those guns are coming from, because I think we really need to focus in on what guns are actually being used in connection with violent crime. And if we're able to pass that funding, we'll be, I think, the second state in the entire country to have a statewide Crime Gun Intelligence Center.
Doña Ana County Sheriff Kim Stewart said that firearm legislation is meant to keep New Mexicans safe, but much of the proposed legislation is just not enforceable from a law enforcement perspective.
How would we enforce that? You know, we're going to be stopping people and say, give me your magazine. I want to count how many rounds you have in the gun. Some of this is just a very high degree of impossibility to do anything about. So you have to ask yourself, are we doing this for reasons of the greater good, or are we doing it to fill space?
Stewart said that she's also in favor of House Bill 9, but said that House Bill 100, which would create a 14-day waiting period for gun buyers, likely wouldn't have the effect that legislators are hoping for.
Some of these obligations in the end fall back to the sheriff. And as for us, that would be a lift to do these background investigations. So it's unclear from that particular legislation who would even do it. Again, 400 million guns, 350 million people. If you need a gun, you'll get one pretty quickly. Waiting 2 more weeks or whatever, it's fine intention, I get it, but it's just not real. It's not going to have the impact I think these well-meaning people want.
As of February 9th, House Bill 9 was reported by the House Judiciary Committee with a do-pass recommendation, and House Bill 100 was reported by the House Consumer and Public Affairs Committee with a do-pass recommendation. The New Mexico legislative session goes until March 18th. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker.
Later in the program, Jonny joins us to offer more perspective on the issue. Now we're joined by New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence co-president Miranda Viscoli. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And let's begin with some concerns Doña Ana County Sheriff Kim Stewart laid out with the difficulty facing departments like hers when it comes to enforcement of many regulations, if and when passed, when you consider the fact that there are already more guns than people in our country.
I think some of the depends on the legislation. So in terms of the assault weapons ban and the magazine, the higher magazine clip ban, yes, those would be really hard to enforce. A lot of people already own those weapons, already own those magazines. I don't know how you would take that back. Even when you grandfather it in, you're going to have the issue of registration. That doesn't mean that New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence wouldn't like to see an assault weapons ban. I think they are war tools designed to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. I don't think New Mexico is ready for that right now. There is other legislation that is very important that can be enforced. That would be a piece of legislation that Las Cruces, Senator Cervantes, is proposing, Senate Bill 427, which would be a 14-day hold on the sale of firearms.
I'd like to get deeper into that 14-day waiting period. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, 427 is the bill that prohibits the sale of a firearm without a background check or a waiting period, but there's also another bill that just calls for the waiting period. It does seem like there's, myriad legislation, and it's a little bit hard to keep up. So why do we have 2 bills dealing with that same topic of that waiting period?
So they're both somewhat similar. So we have in the House Bill 100 with Representative Andrea Romero. That's sitting on the House floor waiting for its vote. And then we have Senator Cervantes, Senate Bill 427. There are a lot of similarities with them. They both are a 14-day hold on the sale of firearms. They both we already require a background check. So if you need to include the background check in one, you can, but we already have passed the background check law. Senator Cervantes' bill also would exempt concealed carry permit holders, whereas the House bill does not. And so I think that's probably one of the main differences there. And then he also has a misdemeanor in his bill, which would make it, if that FFL, which is a federal firearms licensee holder, does that sale before 14 days, then they will be charged with a misdemeanor. So his has a little more teeth to it. Both, I think, are very good pieces of legislation. A 14-day hold in terms of suicide prevention is one of the main reasons why we're looking at this. We had a 16.8% spike in gun deaths in New Mexico in 2021, our latest numbers. 314 of those were suicide. In addition to that, a lot of people talk about let's get tough on crime, right? Well, one, we can't incarcerate our way out of this. And 2, many of our gun deaths in New Mexico, or the majority, are suicide and crimes of passion. That 14-day hold would be a game changer when it comes to reducing those numbers.
Some do argue that, especially when it comes to crimes of passion, people need to be able to defend themselves when faced with a threat. So what do you say to argue that point, that you might be prohibiting someone with that 14-day waiting period from getting a weapon for self-defense?
We hear that a lot, especially in terms of domestic violence. So we have 2 responses to that. One, when we passed the domestic violence firearms relinquishment law 4 years ago with, again, Senator Cervantes, the names are getting backed up into the NCIC. So getting that extra few days will give law enforcement a better opportunity, one, to make sure those names of those domestic violence offenders are getting in, and two, to just give that extra bit of time, right? In addition to that, and believe me, I work very hard on domestic violence prevention. It's one of our biggest priorities at New Mexicans to prevent gun violence. So I don't say this lightly. If a woman is being stalked or worried that she's going to be hurt by her previous domestic partner and impulsively goes out to buy a gun to defend herself, that gun has a much higher chance of hurting her. She will have no gun safety training. It'll be a highly volatile, dangerous, and emotional situation. Most likely her hands will be shaking. The chances of that gun being ripped out of her hand and used against her are very high. Law enforcement goes through hours and hours upon training on how to deal with an active shooter or somebody who's a threat. A woman who impulsively, in a very emotionally volatile situation, buys that firearm, most likely it's going to hurt her. Our advice would be to get to a domestic violence shelter until they can figure out how to keep that woman and potentially her family safe, or not woman. Domestic partners can be any gender, obviously, and they are, and it's important to look at that. But I don't think buying that firearm is going to necessarily make that person safer.
Later on, we'll hear some various opinions when it comes to any new gun laws. And one of those opinions is that it really is the responsibility of the individual and not necessarily the government to make sure that firearms are stored safely in homes. One of the bills considered by the New Mexico Legislature would be the Safe Storage bill, which is intended to keep children from accessing firearms in the home. Where does your organization stand on that?
We've been working to pass a child access prevention law since 2017, so 5 years. We're finally getting there. I 100% disagree. If gun owners were being safe with their guns, they wouldn't be getting in the hands of children, right? It's the third leading cause of death for children in New Mexico. Gun owners have to lock up their guns. The amount that are getting stolen is disconcerting. And those stolen guns are now being sold on Snapchat and Instagram by our teenagers. So I think if we can set a community standard, which is what that piece HB 9 does, the Child Access Prevention Law, and as well as pairing it with educational PSAs to remind gun owners how important it is to lock up their gun. And there's a bit of misinformation out there about HB 9. It's not saying you have to lock up your gun. If you want to keep your loaded semi-automatic handgun on your nightstand to protect yourself, you can. That's not, the bill doesn't say you have to have it locked up. If your 16-year-old gets hold of that gun and does something unfortunate with it and hurts him or herself or somebody else, then yes, you are liable.
Now, we've seen that happen, I think, a first in our country where parents are possibly held liable for the actions of their teenager. Why do you think that hasn't happened more commonly in the past?
I think that we're finally realizing that gun owners need to be held accountable, right? They've had, the NRA and the corporate gun lobby have had control over most of our state legislatures throughout the country. I think right now people have had enough. When you look at school shootings, the majority of school shooters are children and teens who get guns from the home, their family, right? So this is a simple fix to hold gun owners accountable.
A lot of supporters of gun rights will say that we really just need to focus on the laws that are already in place and enforce those. How much weight do you give to that argument?
Well, we don't have enough laws in place, right? So yes, that's true. It's one of the reasons why New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence has actually hired somebody to train law enforcement on how to use the domestic violence firearm relinquishment law that we passed and the extremist protection order law that we passed, right? So our laws are only good as our training, as good as our communication about them. So yes, that's true. We do need to do that. But in addition to that, New Mexico, up and before 2017 didn't have one gun violence prevention law in the books. So there's a lot that we still have to do because we're playing catch up from the decades upon decades when the NRA and the corporate gun lobby had so much control over our elected officials in New Mexico.
Just a moment ago, you mentioned, some misconceptions that people have about some of the legislation being considered. Why do you think those misconceptions exist? And what would you say to folks who maybe think that these laws are targeting what would be described as law-abiding gun owners?
I think the misconceptions happen when the NRA puts out thousands upon thousands of emails that misrepresent a bill. So for instance, you have to have your gun locked up. No, that's not in HB 9. In addition to that, I think if you look at the legislation we're proposing, and that doesn't include the assault weapons ban, I understand that actually would be a very, very heavy lift in New Mexico. But the laws we're looking at, I think, are fair, and especially for that 14-day hold. You get the person trying to purchase the gun still gets their firearm, unless they are prohibited, right? So I think if we look at the issue of gun violence and how many people are being shot and killed in the state of New Mexico, we know we have a problem. So if we can come to the table, both sides, come to the table and look at possible gun laws that would be fair to gun owners, I think we all have to compromise a bit. And I think that's exactly what Senator Cervantes is trying to do with Senate Bill 427 is, hey, and he's a gun owner. And the reason why he went to, is pursuing this is because he went to go buy a firearm and he got a gun within an hour. And he thought, that's a little too quick. I unfortunately know families who call us and say, my son or my daughter just went to the local gun store, bought a firearm, and they were dead hours later. Is there anything we can do? And the only thing we can say to them is sadly, no. I mean, I would strongly suggest a grief counselor, right?
And many argue that mental health is one of the things that may be left out too much of these conversations. How do you feel about the two pairing together to fight that particular issue?
Well, for one, Senate Bill 427 is directly addressing mental illness. It's directing people who have suicidal ideation. Those impulses can go quickly. So if somebody could have that cooling off period. I also think that the mental health argument is one, stigmatizing people with mental illness, right? Saying that, hey, if you suffer from mental illness, you're dangerous. Let's focus on that. So I think not only does it stigmatize those suffering from mental illness, we know that gun laws will help make sure that guns don't end up in unsafe hands, including those who are suffering from mental illness. So I think it's been a way to not pay attention to the importance of passing common sense gun violence prevention legislation.
Miranda Viscoli is the co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence. Thank you for offering your perspective on this important issue.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now back to multimedia journalist Jonny Coker, who spoke to gun enthusiasts about the proposed bills before the New Mexico Legislature.
This year during the New Mexico legislative session, multiple bills have been put forth regarding firearm-related legislation. The laws range from requiring gun owners to keep guns stored in a manner that would keep them away from children, to a complete ban on possession of most semi-automatic firearms. Dan Parrott is the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association District 10 Director. He said that the responsibility of storing a firearm properly should rest on the gun owner, not the government.
I agree that firearms should be stored safely to where children and minors cannot get to them. By the same token, though, it's up to the homeowner and the gun owners to be responsible and take care of their firearms and handle them and store them in a safe manner that is accessible only to them. And if they're needed for a house intrusion or some other assault on your person, they should be readily available.
In terms of other legislation currently in the Roundhouse, Parrott said while they may mean well, he does not believe that the laws would lead to meaningful change in the right direction.
In general, I think all the gun laws that are being proposed this year are not necessarily good gun laws. They infringe on people's rights. It infringes on common sense and safety as to how to handle the guns. From the standpoint of having to wait 14 days to buy a firearm, that gets down that if a lady is threatened by her boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend, she has to wait 14 days to get a firearm that might help save her life or save an assault on her. So again, it gets back to common sense.
Parrott said that the biggest issues with current gun legislation, specifically the bills that would ban semi-automatic weapons and magazines over 10 rounds, is that it would only punish law-abiding citizens if passed.
The one thing that I would emphasize that it seems like we're doing with these laws, we're making felons out of law-abiding citizens at this point in time. We've went to training, we've got concealed carry license, we've paid our state tax for those licenses, and yet the state legislature turns around and takes those rights away from the law-abiding citizens, but there does not seem to be any mandatory punishment or increased punishment for the criminals that violate the laws that are on the books already.
Bill Butler is the executive vice president of a nonprofit organization called Friends of the Law Loose Range and a United States Army veteran. He said that he's also in favor of responsible gun ownership, but believes that legislators writing these laws should be familiar with firearms before crafting legislation.
If you're going to be making rules or talking about how to administer some project or process, you best be able to explain what that process is and have a little bit of understanding about it. We have enough laws on the books right now that if they were enforced, there would be a considerable lessening of violence, gun violence, knife violence, club violence, you name it.
Butler argued that no matter how many laws are passed, criminals will be able to obtain a gun.
Oh, they may regulate till they turn blue in the face. But my suggestion is, just because there's a law doesn't mean something might not be done to circumvent that law or to change that law or to go around that law. I mean, if the opportunity is available, someone will get what they want to do what they want with.
While lawmakers in Santa Fe continued to discuss gun control legislation, Butler said that the constitutional right of New Mexicans to own firearms is not something that should even be up for debate. The New Mexico legislative session ends on March 18th. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker.
Jonny is with us now to offer some additional thoughts on the perspectives he heard from various stakeholders. Jonny, was there any kind of consensus on any of these pieces of legislation that you could find from all of the folks that you talked to, even though their opinions are so different?
Any consensus on the legislation? Not a ton. I mean, it's a very divisive issue. The only thing that I know that people really agreed upon is giving people more access to opportunity and jobs and economic prosperity is the best way to keep people from involving themselves in gun violence. However, that's kind of where the similarities end. How to do that type of thing or anything like that, no one can seem to agree on really anything from the people that I talked to. And I think that's pretty standard when you look at this issue.
Well, we talked about HB 9, which deals with children getting access to firearms in homes. What about the fact that, so many children end up hurt or dead because of guns in the home? And was there any kind of agreement on issues relating to children?
Well, that's the other thing. I talked to a lot of gun enthusiasts who really didn't believe it was the government's problem to deal with that issue. It should be up to the individual's responsibility. But they didn't think that adding another law would deter that sort of thing. I mean, I even talked to people. I know Miranda Viscoli, when she was talking to you, she mentioned, it's not illegal to have a handgun loaded, ready to go on your nightstand. And I talked to a lot of people that said, yeah, I have loaded rifles and guns in my closet because that's the point of a weapon, is to be able to use it. You know, if they need to use it, they don't want to have to unlock it and you know, be in a position to where they need to use it and they can't.
In a self-defense situation,
right, in a self-defense
every second
situation.
matters.
So in that way, you know, people didn't like the idea that they had the government telling them maybe they should not do that type of thing. But there is a misconception there because it's not illegal.
Correct, correct. Now, I know you talked with law enforcement officials, including Doñana County Sheriff Kim Stewart, about the difficulty in enforcing new laws, and Miranda Viscoli agreed that some of these pieces of legislation would be difficult to enforce. How did the sheriff expand on her thoughts regarding new gun legislation and where her department would fall?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of that, I mean, when it comes to seizing guns and people's guns, she was even just talking about the physical space limitations. You know, there are so many guns on the street, and if, you know, let's say semi-auto rifles were banned, you know, waiting for the court proceedings to go through and waiting, you know, having a place to even store these weapons is not something that they are equipped for in any facet. So I think that's something that legislators don't understand with how long, you know, court proceedings take, and a lot of people have these weapons even just as like valuable museum pieces type of thing. So it's just a really difficult thing to enforce for law enforcement.
All right, Jonny Coker, multimedia journalist with KRWG Public Media. It's great to have you on the program. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks.
And that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 a.m. to 9. Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2, and All Things Considered from 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm KC Counts. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.